hour ahead of us. I am so excited to be here. Welcome back. In these pieces that we've talked about today, we have talked about how digital technologies, emerging technologies, AI, are becoming part of the infrastructure of our world. And we can't talk about what good looks like unless we're talking about people's experience on a granular, everyday basis in these digital environments. I am deeply honored today to invite this panel of people who are thinking in different ways about what good could be, and certainly about how it is we might, pause for siren, how it is that we might begin to build different kinds of digital futures. So joining me first, I'd like to bring into our conversation Joe Ryrie. He is the co-founder and director of Smartphone Free Childhood. This organization has sprinted over the last 18 months, and we'll let him tell the story of the organization, but truly representing, I think, a movement in this country of people, ordinary families, demanding some change. So, Joe, welcome. Tell me a little bit about how you get to be here.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It is very surreal to be sat here in front of you, I have to say. It's all very sort of white and bright and scary. But partly because this was definitely not the bingo card 18 months ago, because Smartphone Free Childhood was an organisation, well, is an organisation, now is actually an organisation that started kind of by accident. So the story is, my wife, who is my co-founder, started, well, actually go back a little bit. We've got 3 kids. The eldest of our children is now 10. She was obviously 9 a year ago. And kids in her class started getting smartphones. And we've got some sort of older nephews and nieces, and our, their families have been struggling with this problem. And Daisy was really, really animated and really worried about this problem because it just seemed crazy that we were about to give, or have to give our 8 and 9-year-old a smartphone. Anyway, she was talking about it a lot and started a WhatsApp group with a friend of ours talking about this issue. And then this thing happened on a play date where basically Daisy had a conversation with another mum who came round to our house and said that the only reason she wasn't going to get her own daughter a smartphone was because she hadn't asked for one. That sent Daisy to tailspin. She then went upstairs, I remember it well, did a post on Instagram all about this issue. She's not a big Instagram influencer or anything like that. Just talking about this issue, picture of our kids. Does anyone else feel like this is a crazy situation? Why are we in this position that no one wants to be in, but we feel like we don't have a choice? Posted about it. We had some friends around for dinner. Opened our phone up a few hours later. This post had gone absolutely insanely viral. Then the WhatsApp group that she started with our friend had filled up. I now know a lot about WhatsApp group numbers. You could have 1,024 participants in the WhatsApp group. That had filled up, and then people started their own Smartphone Childhood WhatsApp groups all over the country. They started springing up, and of course that's the next 48 hours. So there were thousands of parents that were worried about the same thing, saying, we agree, this is crazy, but what can we do about this? And so the first week was a really strange sort of viral moment happening in our house. And looking back, this now seems kind of crazy, but about a week after that, so 2 weeks in, Daisy and I decided that the universe is telling us something. There's this huge problem out here in society that loads of parents are feeling that they're struggling with. There's very little guidance out there for parents. Most of the guidance around online safety at that point was basically assumed you were going to get your kid a smartphone aged 8, 9, 10, and then once you've got one, how do you keep them safe on there? But ignoring the elephant in the room, which is, hang on a minute, is this a good idea? And so we decided we would quit our jobs and focus all our energy on trying to build this campaign, build this movement, and see if we could try and make a difference to this issue. So that's been the sort of what I described to somebody else just earlier on, the weird, wild, and wonderful 18 months has been started like that, and we've been focused a lot on all our energy has really been focused on how do we take that kind of feeling that parents all over the country have, and this worries and this concern, because parents are worried about so many things. Like the conversations that parents were having in these WhatsApp groups initially was like, obviously the things that people worry about, like access to inappropriate material, harmful content, addiction, like sleep, cyberbullying, all these safeguarding concerns. Almost everyone was worried about the amount of time kids were spending on their devices, even like irrespective of the content they were accessing. And so we were kind of like, we see our job as saying, okay, there's this strength of feeling out there, how can we shepherd it and turn it into something that actually makes a difference? And so we are, most of our work is focused on two main areas. So my background is I used to run a branding consultancy, I did a lot of work with startups, so we kind of approached it through that lens, data journalist, and our strategy is really about cultural change rather than policy change. So whilst we sort of believe wholeheartedly that there needs to be much tougher regulation on the tech companies, because we've tried really, really carefully through all the communications and how we try to build this conversation to focus the sort of crosshairs on where they should be focused, which is on the tech companies that are profiting in the billions from getting our kids addicted to their platforms, rather than what can easily happen, which is the conversation an argument between parents on parents, judging other parents for making decisions they might want to make. This is not a problem of individual failure, this is a problem of systemic failure. And so whilst we agree that ultimately there needs to be far tougher regulation on these tech platforms, we see that what we can do and the role that we can play is actually about trying to foster this grassroots fight back. How can we bring as many people as possible into this conversation, because we know it's a conversation that thousands, we've got 350,000 parents in our network now, so definitely hundreds of thousands, almost certainly millions of parents are concerned about, and in fact, surveys out there suggest that keeping kids safe online and on social media on their smartphones has risen from out of nowhere to being the #1 parental concern for a lot of parents in this country. So it's a huge issue, and a lot of parents feel like they don't have a choice, and we want to create choice for parents. So we want to bring as many people into this conversation, and once they're in the conversation, provide solutions, provide community, and provide solidarity to them, so that ultimately we change this situation that we're in now, which is this is what we describe as the impossible position. You either give your child a product that you really don't want to give them because of all the harms that many of you guys in the room will be well aware of, or you risk ostracizing them and alienating them from their social group. It's exactly the time in their life when you don't want to do that, because one is particularly that transition to secondary school. At the moment, parents don't, like, that's not really a choice. That's a choice that regulation, in a situation that regulation should be doing more to solve. But in the meantime, our solution is to bring people together to agree collectively to delay getting a smartphone for a few more years. Like, a lot of people try and characterise us as not eligible to ban smartphones. That's not what we're trying to do at all. We're just trying to create choice so that parents feel like if they want to choose a different path, that's a viable alternative. And then the solution to doing that is through community, through collective action, and we're spending a lot of our time figuring out the kind of tools and the technology and the stories that enable that to happen.
That's fantastic. I mean, one of the things I really admire about what you're doing is taking the experience that all parents are having now, and turning it into something where we can have a collective conversation rather than struggles between parents and their children, or really kind of voicing and bringing that together. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Yeah, I think this is a rare issue that kind of unites people on all sides of the political spectrum. It's been interesting kind of observing being the centre of initially this like media storm. There's been lots of media attention. What kind of happens naturally just because of the media landscape is you get people want you to be in this cultural war space of like, you want to ban smartphones, but they say that smartphones are good, and we're actually saying that it's much more complicated than that. But there's a universal concern that's got nothing to do with politics that's saying that we all want the best for our kids, we all want them to grow up safe, we all want them to have a good childhood, we all want to set them up for a better future. And at the moment, this technology is maybe more difficult for all of us to do that. And so we're trying really hard to not fall into that trap of making it a polarized thing and getting on our eyeballs and telling people that that they're doing something wrong, because we're all just trying to figure this out. This technology has outpaced regulation dramatically in the last 10 or 15 years. It didn't even exist 15 years ago, and now it's like the #1 concern that parents have. So that's not a left or right thing, that's not a north or south thing, that's a universal thing that people are feeling. And so, yeah, we're trying to represent that concern in a way that brings people together rather than dividing people.
Speaking of telling people that they're wrong, I think that's a good segue to bring in Poppy Nayak, who is at AWO, which is a legal and advocacy organization. And you've done a lot of work around harms. You are known, you have built this agency and practice around really addressing some key harms. What's front of your mind in terms of the things that you're addressing now?
Thank you. Quite an introduction, telling people that they're wrong. It's my wife. But I'm very lucky. At AWO, I'm a solicitor, I'm the legal director, we get to do amazing work. I guess at the opposite end of the spectrum from Joe, because people come to us saying, what can we do? Something has gone wrong. And that's given me a breadth of experience and understanding of where people are and where harms are and where the law can affect change. And that's given me maybe 3 different hats, which I think is a good way to explore where we are, and then I can maybe come to the second point. So the 3 hats I have. Firstly, we have the advisory hat. So we work with some tech companies that want to maybe make a virtue, show the value in compliance and rights respecting approaches to technology. We also work with policymakers, and we do interesting work on providing legal analysis of whether law actually applies to technology. So there's a lot of discussion about new regulations, but there's maybe less about where the law is and how it can apply, and as well as just what the law practically does when the law seeks to apply. We did a really interesting report with Ada Lovelace Institute a couple of years ago, looking at AI harms. We came up with 4 hypothetical but real scenarios where AI harms might arise, and we try to explain how the law maps across to that, all the way from the start of somebody's journey where the harm arises, all the way through to how do they enforce their rights. And that was really helpful because it let us understand where the law is, why it works and why it might not, and it allowed us to create a colour-coded 1-page chart which shows where there's good regulation, where there's bad regulation, why law is difficult to enforce. So we do that advisory work. What we're probably more well known for is our litigation work, where we tell people they're wrong. Thankfully, the courts tend to agree with us. And the litigation arm is really interesting. It's where the high-profile stuff happens. And I guess we are one of the few law firms that has a track record of algorithmic accountability for our clients. I can point to 2 recent cases. One is a case with online gambling, and the algorithms behind the targeted advertising systems on online gambling. And it's a very stark example where online advertising can have real-world harms, because individuals are targeted on the basis of their vulnerabilities, and the underlying data behind that was part of our main case. The case was RTM, it was heard in January this year, and our work in that wasn't just bringing the case, but there was a background. We had to uncover, understand, and hold to account the algorithms, present it to a judge, explain where it was wrong. And that was really successful in some of the metrics and images we used before the court, being front page of the New York Times and had a lot of traction. We also had another case against Meta this year where our client successfully got Meta to stop using her personal data to target adverts at her, direct marketing to her. And that's a really interesting precedent. They settled on the eve of trial, so there's no case I can talk about. But it's really interesting to have a successful case where somebody had said, I do not want this. I want you to stop using my data to direct marketing to me. And that, I think, will set an important precedent, that people's relationship and people's agency can take platforms. My 3rd hat, if that's even an analogy anymore, is I'm a professor of practice at UCL, where I teach AI to lawyers. AI in practice to lawyers, and it's really interesting to see the breadth and the expertise of people that come. They're interested. My profession is pivoting to understand how they can use AI, but also the good and the bad, and trying to actually understand what it means. To your last point about what's top of my agenda or AWO's agenda, there are many different things. I mean, it's just something we look at daily, but I'd say 3 main things. Firstly, it's really important for us to make clear to people that they have rights and better understanding of their rights, because unless people know their rights, stand by their rights, and use their rights, those rights are hollow. And secondly, using those rights to prize open a bit of what people refer to as the black box. We do have quite strong laws. The laws that we have allow people to have an understanding of what data is being used, how they can understand what data is used between different parties, the recipients of their information. So we've encouraged people, we're trying to encourage people to use those rights. And thirdly, once you've understood that data, trying to ensure that people stand by those rights to get redress and accountability. I think that's maybe the hardest thing. Bringing cases is quite expensive. But there are regulators in the space, regulators can be really effective. I talked about the online gambling case, the Information Commissioner's Office also took enforcement action in the same space. There are really effective regulators, and people should seek to rely and speak to regulators to enforce their rights and make the laws have the ability to change the space really well.
And moving into rights, and rights that we might not think of in different spaces. I'm going to bring in Aisha White, who is recently named the Director of Intelligence for a group called Check My Ads. And on the one hand, in the ad space, we might think, well, you know, what does all of this media ecosystem, online AI ecosystem have to do with businesses having the right to understand where their ads end up online? But tell us, why is the ad space and the ad tech space specifically so important?
The ad tech space is really important for a couple of reasons. One, it's almost a $700 billion a year industry, and there are hundreds, if not thousands, of players in the market at any given time. So that includes publishers, it includes agency holding companies and independent agencies that represent the brands. Of course, it includes brands, some of whom represent themselves, and then in addition, it includes publishers. And then, of course, it includes all of us. We are, and our data is a commodity for these sorts of campaigns. So, in a previous life, I was a programmatic media buyer for a decade. So, I bought media on behalf of very large corporations, including Sony Pictures Entertainment and in the UK, People's Postcode Lottery. And I also worked at agencies. So I worked at now what is referred to as WPP, which at the time was the world's largest holding company for an agency. But I've also worked at independent agencies, and I've also worked at tech side. So I've done everything in-house. And in that, I kind of got to understand quite significantly how data is extracted in the programmatic process. So when any of us visit a website or an app, you probably notice that there are ads on there. You might be like, well, you know, how do these ads pay for? Sometimes they're relatively well. And you're like, oh yeah, that is a pair of shoes I would actually quite like, okay. And then sometimes you're like, oh, this ad's a bit creepy. Like I was talking about this to somebody, and then I'm getting this ad, and this is just, you know, it's very uncomfortable. And a lot of that is manufactured by a process called real-time bidding. And so how real-time...
Pause for dramatic.
I could have planned that better. And so how real-time bidding works, it's very similar to a financial market. So folks who may be familiar with like day trading, you can purchase ad space online automatedly. So this is called programmatic. There's other ways to purchase it programmatically, which represents currently something like 68% of the market. So it's like the largest way of buying media that no one seems to have ever heard of. And programmatic involves quite a few players. So first you have, of course, the brand. Sometimes an agency will, or more typically an agency will buy media space on behalf of the brand. And then you have a platform. It's like a piece of software where you buy the ad, and then there are all these players in between who kind of act as brokers for the publishers. So for example, I'm just going to pick on a very random website. I'm not saying this is necessarily accurate, but we'll pick on The Guardian today. And perhaps, The Guardian is utilizing Google to monetize their space on maybe their app, but also on their website. Well, Google's the most famous, but there are hundreds of others that are involved. There are even social media platforms who may also monetize space on the open web, which a lot of people are unaware of. TikTok, for example, has a ad product called Panel, where people like you and me, or publishers, can choose to create ad space on a website where there was no ad space previously. So when an advertiser, a brand or agency goes back to TikTok and wants to buy ads, they may not realize that they're also buying ads not only on TikTok, the app itself, but off on the Guardian. So they're doing it twice over. So there's quite a lot in the advertising ecosystem. But how the advertising ecosystem has worked currently, as I've explained it, it's changing quite quickly. I saw a very interesting quote on, I want to say it was X recently, that said something very, at first that was funny, and then I kind of sobered a bit, which was, us millennials, we were raised by the internet, but y'all, Gen Alphas, y'all are raised by the algorithm. And at first I was like, oh, haha, it's kind of pithy and funny. And then I was like, oh, actually, that's kind of like, so it's quite disturbing in a way when you really think about it, like what that means, right? So like in the old, ye old days of the internet, and until kind of more recently now, if I wanted to go out searching for information, right, I would have to type it in. I'd have to go looking for it. But now all these things are recommended with algorithmic engines. And now with the advent of AI, we're seeing that these AIs are built to the spec of the platforms of which they serve, right? Which is a surprise to nobody. But as someone earlier in the panel had mentioned, that these AIs are built around engagement. Well, something that folks should be aware of with the advertising sector is that the models on which they are cost out, so how advertisers and agencies pay for advertising space on the internet, is based on a cost per engagement model. So it could be cost per 1,000 impressions, it could be cost per click, it could be cost per view. And so what we're seeing is virality pays. Virality begets volume, and then volume begets revenue. And we're like, okay, that's well and good. It makes sense why certain content creators and certain publishers, may have clickbaity titles and stuff. But what it doesn't quite explain is the fact that ad tech firms also profit from this in a revenue sharing type model. So if I wanted to, I could create a website, AishaLikesThimbles.com. Just pick that one out of nowhere. And I could make an AI slop site totally dedicated to thimbles. This is very benign, right? But it's not hardly engaging journalism, it's hardly incredible content creation. And what we see, right, is that I could get the website monetized in a very short amount of time, just a few minutes. And there's not really any verification checks. There's no real codified, regulated requirements around know your business customer. So yeah, I like thimbles, and I've got this AI slop website dedicated to thimbles, but who's to say that I don't have a website or app or something else that could be dedicated to something quite nefarious? And then again, as we see, right, the algorithms, products, these get recommended. What we're looking at now is we're seeing algorithmic products recommended to advertisers when they utilize the buying software. So advertisers actually don't know where they're buying their media. So to make this a little bit clearer, if you were to go to Google, they have a very now famous product called Performance Max. Performance Max requires that you provide your website or your business information, whatever, and they will build assets for you using AI. So they've got the copy, they'll maybe ask you for a logo, but then they'll take your logo and kind of make these assets for you, banners, videos, you name it. You don't have to really lift a finger. And this is aimed mostly at small and medium-sized businesses, but the world's largest agencies also use Performance Max. Up until relatively recently, you could not pull a report to know where you were running. So a brand would have no idea that they were running on AishaLikesNimbles.com if they were utilizing the Performance Max system. There's no way. Nowadays, Meta has a similar product. It's called Advantage Plus. Google has outdone itself with a new product called AI Max. I did not make that name up, that's really what it's called. And we're seeing similar products following suit. So it's hard to know, one, how these ads are being targeted because the platforms don't tell you. And then second, it's hard to know where your media is running. And as I mentioned, it's really easy to get monetized. It's easier than ever because a lot of the monetization aspects can be open source. So the solutions that we're looking at Check My Ads include updates to policy. It's time to regulate the digital advertising industry in particular. There should be best interest duties for the ad tech firms who represent both buyers and sellers, so in this case, publishers and brands, but also things like basic stuff. Like I can't open a bank account without providing some form of ID. It should probably be the same for those who choose to monetize their content online, but it also should be the same for advertisers, because if not, that's how you end up with scammy ads online.
So you're telling me this is a multi-$100 billion a year sector.
Correct.
There's no transparency, and it's helping to fuel the worst slop and hate online.
Absolutely. We know for a fact that everyone's talking about AI overviews, AI this. AI overviews, by some estimates, have brought down publisher revenues by 30% in 1 year. So when we look at these sort of systems, we're punishing, really, like journalism and entertainment that we all really enjoy, but then we're seeing the rise of AI slop at the same time because, again, it's like, how can you get the system to, engage with you? So if we're, siphoning off our attention from siphoning off our attention from, websites that provide some sort of value, and we give that a value to the overviews instead, we have to kind of start thinking about how we're going to kind of square that circle. Exactly that phrase.
We'll take it. I'm going to bring Professor Lorna Woods into the conversation. She is an affiliate with us at the Minderoo Centre, and of course was instrumental in helping to do some of the legal thinking behind the Online Safety Act. She also is an advisor to the Online Safety Network and has been thinking quite a bit about the tools and mechanisms that we have in law and where they might be falling down.
Thanks, Gina. I think I pick up where Aisha left off in terms of looking at what regulation we have, online regulation, and this problem of particularly programmatic advertising and the way it is linked to various sorts of online harms, both direct in terms of the scamming ads, but also indirect in terms of the consequences for service design, which can then lead to dark patterns, addictive behaviours, and other forms of problematic content. I suppose we've got two main types of regulation that might be relevant here. We've got data protection, which is the terrain of Ravi more than me. And that operates on the whole, where is the data coming from for targeting adverts and all that good stuff. But it only partially addresses the issues. There are more issues with online ads, which you reverted to, things like money laundering, the support of illegal content, as well as sort of scam content. So the other place to look is the Online Safety Act. And in this context, I think in terms of actual scope, maybe it covers part of the terrain in terms of how it's been implemented so far. not very enthusiastically, you know, if we're looking at the ad content. And then in terms of the services, again, we've got patchy coverage. So I'll just say a little bit more about each of those. So the Online Safety Act targeted user-to-user services, which is basically social media and messaging, and search. So the open web, you know, blog sites and all sorts of other sites are not covered. So if we're worried about content there, we are looking at the general law, you know, does the criminal law apply, have we got defamation, can the ASA in terms of advertising content do something? So yeah, maybe there's bits and pieces, but it's piecemeal and there's no clear actor to take things forward. So that's one problem. Within the Online Safety Act, there is a difference in the way user-to-user services and search services are treated. And for search services, advertising content isn't relevant content for the regulated duties. And I always thought this was a bit odd, because actually if Google's targeting ads at you, that's the bit it can control much more than the search results it was coming up with. But nonetheless, we have this position that, the advertising content itself doesn't trigger duties for search services. The position for user-to-user services is, if I can use the technical term, a mess. There was concern at the time the bill was published about fraudulent ads. So we have, for fraudulent ads, a separate set of duties that sort of dock on to the main duties that user-to-user services and search services are subject to. But as regards user-to-user, the language is a little bit odd, so it's not clear whether advertising content is in the duties or outside the duties. So that's not helpful in terms of actually getting clear enforcement. As regards the fraud duties, anyway, we're waiting for them to come in and enforce it. There's some question marks about what Ofcom is going to do. So that, if you like, is about the content of ads, the scam, the adverts for guns, or what have you. There is the question of the back end, which is partly taken care of by data protection, but not entirely. As we've seen, or as Aisha mentioned, there's a move to automation within the services. So you want to go and sort of do ads, it's all automated. Nobody's really looking at that process, what what your business is, who you are, what you're advertising, who you want to advertise to. So there is a question of whether that automated process has actually automated some due diligence safeguards in there, and my suspicion is probably not. The other issue with this is this impact on business model. Now, technically, the Act as defined says there must be a risk assessment, has to be a risk assessment on features and functionalities, but also business model. So it could be that at some point Ofcom starts to look at the impact of monetised strategies on the risks, but we've not seen that so far. What we've seen Ofcom saying is that there are some of the identified harms that are affected by monetisation strategies, but that there isn't evidence across the board. And it's certainly not required services to do anything so far. Hopefully, they'll start to look at that, especially if people start giving them evidence, but not yet. One final point, if I can, Gina, is to say, well, why was advertising perhaps not dealt with? I think there's probably a logic to it in the sense that you have got the open web, and I think the original intention, and there's probably other people in the room who know this better than me, was that advertising was going to be dealt with as a separate ecosystem together to make it make sense. That was the online advertising programme, but that seems to have run onto the shoulders of policy death and isn't really doing much. If I can just respond to a couple of suggestions already made, I think Know Your Client would be an easy, or at least a clear-cut suggestion that Ofcom could make in codes. And that traceability could also be built in. And I think it is not beyond the scope, at least as regards user-to-user services, for Ofcom to ask for that.
So as we have with the other panels, we're soon going to turn the cameras off and have this opportunity for you to be a part of this conversation. Just to launch us into that, I want to say that we've got different approaches that we've put on the table, different provocations that we've put on the table to think about how do we get to thriving societies, right? How do we get to an information ecosystem, these devices and tools that we rely on every day, how do we make sure that they're working for us and not working against us or harming us? So in that, I'm going to invite the camera to turn off. We've got microphones. I see. We've heard some really interesting contributions here, and I want to just bring one. We heard regulators are needed where markets won't look after themselves, and I want to slightly pitch to Joe, movements are needed when markets won't look after themselves. And I think the story that you are able to tell about people's experience around the country is really quite dramatic in terms of this demand for solutions. So you've heard a lot from the room. How would you respond to the things that you've heard today?
There's a lot of things to pick up on. I'm not quite sure where to start, but I do think that it's actually been a fascinating experience for me, having not been in this world at all, and all of you guys who have been thinking about these issues, these huge issues that are shaping society and humanity. And there are so many people doing such fascinating, interesting work. It's hard to keep up, to be honest. But I think the average person on the street has a sense of kind of hopelessness or the inability to change anything because these forces are so powerful and they're so complicated as well. So programmatic advertising, or the issues about regulation are mind-bendingly complicated to the average person on the street. But I think that there is this. I think what we've tapped into, and you rightly mentioned, there's an irony in that we are as addicted to. I'm happy to admit that I'm addicted to my phone. Again, that's because we are all addicted to our phones because the system is designed to set up to make us addicted to our phones. So there is a kind of irony in that, but I think it also taps into a much bigger feeling that as parents we can feel something significant has changed over the last 5 or 10 years. We know that this technology is becoming more sophisticated. We can feel the pull it has in our lives. We know that something's up, even though we can't quite put our finger on what that thing is because it's just so complicated to untangle. And so I think that feeling, that emotion that we all have, and we kind of want to deal with for ourselves, we know we just don't want that to pass on to our children. So I think that's quite important. And the smartphone is, I actually think that the most interesting about what we're doing is kind of tapping into this much broader conversation about the role of technology in society. We're doing it from a kind of layman's perspective, but we're trying to communicate in a way that brings the average person into this conversation because it is a pretty complicated conversation to enter into. So I hope that the work that we're doing can play a small role in just bringing the average person, and that's from all political ends of the spectrum. This is an issue that crosses political lines in a way that very few issues in today's society do, and that's fascinating. And if we thought this was just something that middle-class parents were going to engage with, which wouldn't be doing what we're doing, we know that all the data says that this is an issue that, you don't even need data to tell you this, this is an issue that affects every single parent across the country. And I think that we kind of see our role as, yes, trying to provide solutions to parents to be able to take a different path and delay smart into social media, because there are obvious benefits to that, immediate and obvious benefits to that. But more importantly, just help spark and ignite this much broader conversation so that people start to think about the role that technology is playing in their lives and maybe feel that they can do something about it.
I'm going to use that to bring Aisha in, because in the name, on the tin, as they say, on the tin, it's check my ads. And the my is interesting because it's not really my consumer, it's me as brand or company. If we're dealing with a system that is so difficult for some of the biggest corporations in the world, second to tech companies, to manage, what is that kind of movement, and how might you respond to some of the questions that have been raised in the time that we had the conversation?
Yeah, there was a very good comment made about the idea around money laundering and how that could be applied. The World Federation of Advertisers, which is one of the sort of a self-regulatory body, but more like a trade group, commissioned a study a few years ago and said that by their own admission, digital advertising is the second largest organized crime in the entire world. So the brands are unfortunately very well aware that that this is an issue and that they want it fixed. But as someone else pointed out, well, where do we assign blame? Who is responsible? And in my experience, it's been blame is cyclical. A citizen sees, oh God, that ad is next to some horrendous content. Pick your particular brand of horrendous content, and I'm gonna blow it up on social media or whatever. Maybe you tweet at the brand, and they're like, oh gosh, and they pull it down, and then there's maybe on the back end they do an investigation, and potentially the agency that bought that media on the brand's behalf is like, I used such and such AI thingamajig to do it, and so then they go back to insert ad tech vendor here, and that tech vendor goes, I don't know, I'm not sure. And we have no idea how that would have shown up, how we brokered that. That's so strange. And because there is a lack of familiar business customer, it makes sense. It's hard to track, who you're sharing, potentially who you're sharing revenue with if you're not doing the specific required, or should be required, in my opinion. Verifications. It shouldn't be easier to open a bank account. Sorry, it shouldn't be easier to open or monetize a website or an app than it is to open a bank account, but it is. It shouldn't be easier to set up a Facebook ads profile than it is to open a bank account, but it is. You can get started right now if you want. It's very, very straightforward. There's just so much to speak on. One other thing I wanted to bring up, somebody brought up a question around vulnerabilities and how vulnerabilities are targeted. Very recently, there was a deposition in Congress by Sarah Wynne Williams, who is a former, I believe she's a policy manager at Meta, or was, and she mentioned how there was an advertising product at the time that knew if young women took selfies of themselves on Instagram and then deleted them, Meta would infer that they were feeling insecure and then push ads to them. And so and brands could then select mood, maybe sad or insecure, whatever. And so you think about this sort of stuff, and then you think, well, has that stuff, or at least I think, has that stuff been scrubbed from the large data pool of, they say don't do it anymore, but the data pool that now is being used for AI targeting? We don't know, because the AI targeting aspect in and of itself is a black box, and then where you end up on the internet is often, as well, if you're a brand, very much a black box, and that is changing. But those are some hard-won gains because, unfortunately, folks have found their ads showing up in places that are incredibly unsavory and monetizing some of the most disgusting and most horrific corners of the internet, including sexual abuse material of children, and as well as things like sanctioned websites. And you wonder, is like, if the ad tech companies, are struggling with this, like, how difficult is this for the average consumer to understand? How difficult is it for the brands to steward and advocate for themselves and have their compliance teams stay on top of these sorts of things? And the current industry state is that it's generally self-regulated. So there's lots to do here with actual regulation.
Let's briefly bring in Robbie and Lorna. Robbie, final thoughts.
Oh,
Lots to say.
there's a lot of people that want law lectures by the sounds of things. Trying to piece this all together on all the different questions. I think one thing we need to think is the law in this space is catching up with the technology, both in terms of whether we need new regulation, but the cases take a while to come through. And most cases, particularly the cases we bring, require various levels. It's not just like this bad thing to have, I'm going to sue someone. You have to bring cases to understand what technology is being used, where the data's going, who the data's being shared with. You have to create maps of who might be responsible to get to that point. And then you have to think about your objective. What does an individual want? Do they need to see the entire code behind the system to be able to get accountability? Probably not. It just needs an objective. Most of the time it's either some sort of declaratory relief that something has gone wrong, or to start or stop doing something with their information. So when we think about how we are approaching cases and the questions we've had around this, which are all really good questions, I can talk more one-to-one, we will start with the objective. And we found that if you put your client's objectives and use the principles-based regime, the rights-based regime we have developed in this country, and so we're not looking for monetary redress, we're looking for accountability. We just want a court to say, stop doing that thing, start doing this in a better way. We get much more traction than just, for example, for money for a class. I'd like to think that one of the reasons we are able to piece this all together in a way that maybe other firms have failed to is because we're quite sophisticated how we approach it. If anyone is thinking about cases, come to us. But it is, we're at the start of thinking about how accountability looks, and actually thinking you have to understand the entire coding and how to play the outcome. Probably the wrong way around. You should start with the harm, what somebody wants, and how you get to that end. And we've been successful still. And luckily we have good regulators, we have sophisticated people working with them, thinking about these problems in a very sophisticated and robust way. And I'm quite hopeful that we'll get to a point where we'll have robust, sustainable laws and people will be able to stand by a better future.
Lorna, quick word.
I'm a great believer in trying to apply existing laws to the systems as are, but sometimes I think there's a point when we have to look to see if we need to change some of our fundamental underlying principles. And I think, if we are talking about criminal activities and we run into the question of mens rea, then we maybe need to think about how, are those rules which apply to people, applicable. We have got models where, we've looked at non-human persons, companies. There have been attempts to put criminal liability to companies, so maybe that's a model. But I think that is maybe a place where, you're going to warp the system so much if you don't acknowledge the difference. And I do think just because we impose liability on something doesn't mean it's a human being. We might say it's a legal person, but it doesn't mean it's a human being and has the same rights as human beings. So one other thing I'd like to say about liability, maybe we need to look at causation, maybe we need to look at presumptions, because we've got the distribution chain with AI, with the creation of the models, the training, deployment, further tweaking, goodness knows what. And it's very easy to lose responsibility. So maybe we need to change presumptions, or maybe we need to take a more radical step and say you bear liability until you prove you've taken all the steps that somebody responsible would take, and that maybe goes to the ad industry as well, rather than saying, oh, well, they did that and they did that. Well, prove you wear squeaky clean.
I think that's a great note to end on. Join me in thanking this group.